All right, so this week, again, we're in the second to last sermon before we end our series in Romans chapter 8. And last week, we started talking about if Romans chapter 8, verses 28 through 30 is the peak of this chapter, right? Where we can know that God is working everything for us, in our sufferings and our sin and our weaknesses and our groanings. If he's working all of these things for our good and to make us more like Jesus, then if that's this mountaintop, then as we descend back down into the valleys of our lives and encounter all of these things that we regularly do, then we can have hope. We can have assurance. We can have confidence that God is for us. And so we looked at three rhetorical questions last week that brought us to reflection and then gave us resoluteness and reassurance. And if we could summarize it, last week showed us that if God is for us, then it means that he's for us providentially, which means that he takes care of us as his children. He is committed to taking care of us comprehensively, giving and providing for our greatest needs and even our lesser needs. And so we saw that most clearly in the truth that God gives up his own son for us. How this is sorrowful news because God gives up his own son for us. But it's wonderful news as well because he does for us what we can't do for ourselves. And it's on the basis of Jesus being given for us as a sacrifice in our place for our sin that you and we can be assured that God's going to take care of every other lesser need in our lives because he's met our greatest problem. And therefore the real needs that we have in this life and in this world, the real sufferings and sins that we face that affect us and expose our weaknesses and our insufficiency, we can know that those things don't stand a chance against us. Because of what God has done for us in Jesus, you and I can know as followers of Jesus, as children of God, that we have the high ground. We have the tactical advantage in facing all of the very real things that we face in this world, knowing that God is working for our good and conforming us to the beautiful blueprint of his son, Jesus. And so this week we're continuing to look more at more of these questions of reflection and encouragement that Paul is asking in light of God's promise back in verses 28 through 30. But now these questions that we're going to see move from speaking to us about God's being for us providentially to show that God is for us legally. And so legality has been a theme of this entire chapter because if you look back before Romans chapter 8, we saw in Romans chapter 7 that, and even before that in Romans 5 and 6, that we still have a relationship with God's law. As God's people, we still have a relationship with God's law. God's law hasn't gone anywhere. We are still accountable to it. Everybody in this world is accountable to it. And just because we become Christians doesn't mean that accountability is gone or erased. God's law still requires perfection from us. We'll be judged by it before God. And God's law is still good because it's the essence of who God is and who he's revealed himself to be. So even as followers of Jesus, the law is still a present reality in our lives. And so the question that Romans chapter 5 and 6 has brought up is, what do we do with the law? As people who've been baptized into death and then raised to new life in Jesus, what are we supposed to do with God's law that we cannot keep perfectly? The law that we break and fail epically. Again, sin in us at times keeps us from obeying God's law. And then when we do break and fall short of keeping God's law, we face guilt, real condemnation, real fear. So Romans 7 showed us that we are in this really desperate situation. But Romans 8, it gives us these promises, these beautiful promises that speak to this situation and speak to our guilt. That Jesus sets us free from the penalty that we deserve for breaking God's law, and then he takes our guilt, our shame on himself so that we don't have to experience condemnation. So where we feel bad, where we feel guilty, truly, for the ways that we've broken God's law and acted contrarily towards him in our sin, the good news that Jesus brings into this world is that we don't have to live in that. We don't have to stay in that. The good news of the gospel is that Jesus has done what we can't do for ourselves, in that he has condemned sin by living perfectly in a human body, the same kind of human body that you and I live in. He obeys and keeps God's law perfectly in that human body. And where you and I broke God's law, or we break it every single day of our lives, maybe every single moment, he doesn't. He lives and obeys God perfectly. And he does that for us. Where you and I get angry, Jesus never doesn't get angry sinfully. Where you and I get impatient, Jesus is perfectly patient. And he does that for you. And then he dies sacrificially, bearing the punishment that we deserve for our sin and the ways that we break God's law. He takes on our judgment and our guilty sentence upon himself. The penalty and the punishment that we deserve, which is death. He takes our death, our punishment on himself. Again, if we're in the scenario of God's courtroom, because we're talking about the legality of all of these things, we stand condemned. We deserve judgment and punishment, an eternal sentence of separation from God. But instead of us bearing that punishment and penalty of death, Jesus takes our place. God's perfect Son walks into our courtroom and bears the punishment and penalty for sin that we deserve, so that the judge doesn't look the other way, that he doesn't wink or ignore our very real crimes against him and against each other. But justice is truly satisfied at the cross of Christ, where he dies. And then because of that, because of Jesus, we have the record of his perfect righteousness for us. God sees us as if we had never sinned at all. And that means essentially what Paul says here, that God's law has been fulfilled in us, not because of anything that we could do or couldn't do, but because of what Jesus has done. And so this is a beautiful and legal reality. It's legit. There's no backdoor deals. There's no workings beneath the table. There's no crossing your fingers that this doesn't end up being exposed and you really have to do the time. No, God actually deals with our sin. He deals with our death. And he does that by sending his son Jesus to live in our place and die for our sin, and then be resurrected powerfully so that we can have assurance that God is for us and with us. So now, because of this, we can submit our lives to obeying God's requirements of us. This is our new relationship with God's law. And even when we don't do it perfectly, because of our relationship with God, our relationship to the law has changed, and our primary motivation for keeping God's law now is love. It's in loving him, because our hearts have been transformed, not from these stone cold hearts that only obeyed out of fear or out of cold duty. But our motivation is love for God, seeing who he is and who he's revealed himself to be, what he's done for us in Jesus. In love, we align ourselves to who he is, who he's revealed himself to be. And that's why we obey God's law. That's why we serve him. So God's Spirit living within us helps us with that, is what Romans 8 has shown us. And so even after God's promises of renewing us and working everything together in our lives for our good, after we've seen all of those things, here we are again, back to the law. We haven't really seen it that much since the beginning of Romans chapter 8, but now here we are again, back into the courtroom. But it's different now after coming down from this peak, this mountain peak of God's promises. Things are different. We have hope. We have hope that makes everything different now, which is what this language here communicates. Who can bring a charge against God's elect? And who is the one who condemns? Again, that's language of confidence and resoluteness and assurance. And it's obvious, right? There's obvious confidence behind these questions, and they're rhetorical, just like the questions that we saw last week. And so these are the two questions that we're going to be looking at today, particularly in verses 33 and 34, along with their answers, even though they're rhetorical. So let's look at the first question. Who can bring a charge? Who can bring an accusation? Listen, I don't know if you've ever heard of the nickname the Teflon Don, right? That's what they called John Gotti, who was a New York crime family boss who earned the nickname largely due to charges never being able to stick to him, although he committed mountains and mountains of crime. In the 1980s, he was acquitted from these at least 3 high-profile crimes, which was mostly due to his underhanded mob tactics taking place behind the scenes, influencing the cases. So now you look at these verses, this confident language of who can bring a charge, who can bring an accusation in this courtroom against God's elect. You hear that language, and then you look at us, people who commit some really serious charges when it comes to God's law. We break God's law constantly, even as followers of Jesus, and you've got to ask, has God somehow turned us into Teflon Dons, where these charges are not sticking to us in an unjust way? Is he saying that real accusations against us for breaking God's law that come from us and from others and from Satan won't stick because of some backhanded or underhanded dealings? How can this be just that you and I commit real crimes against God's law, and we're faced with charges of breaking God's law, not just from ourselves but others and even Satan regularly? How can this be the truth? And yet, God is just in forgiving us and giving us this kind of promise that we see in verses 28 through 30. Well, let's back up first. The reality of living in this fallen world as sinful humans who break God's laws is constantly what we're going to be faced with. We're going to be faced with charges and accusations constantly, so don't hold your breath. If you don't know it already, you and I break God's law constantly, even as followers of Jesus. You have and you will do things concerning God's law that you should be charged with in his courtroom. None of us is perfect. We haven't been and we won't ever be. That's not what it means to be a Christian. It's to achieve some type of moral perfection and never break God's law ever again in your life after he saved you. No, we sin and we are sinned against. And if we're not the ones who are being charged, then we're usually the ones who are bringing charges against other people who might have broken God's law. And so this question, it has implications for both of these positions. And so the charges that you and I regularly face from breaking God's law, they come from a whole bunch of places, as I've just said, right? They come from ourselves, they come from others, and they even come from our greatest spiritual adversary, who the Bible calls Satan. And so let's unpack this a little bit more about where these charges come from and the credibility of these charges. Firstly, when it comes to ourselves, there are times when we are our greatest accusers. That is the truth, right? We are our greatest accusers. Why? Because we know the depth of our weaknesses. We know our sin. We know our deepest struggles. We know our most hidden thoughts. We know our deepest motives and intentions. We know the things that we've done in ourselves and even against others. Things that we'd never tell anyone. So if you can imagine when we're sitting in this witness box in God's courtroom, right? Watch that show Loki, and there's these variants of him throughout this show that he's constantly interacting with. There's this other version of us sitting on the other side of the witness stand, bringing these charges against us. You know what you thought. You know what you did. You know how you broke God's law. You know you're not right. So how can God forgive you? How can God justify you? How can God call you his child? Look at these charges. Sometimes we hold up all the evidence of the ways that we failed and broken God's laws and the ways that we deserve punishment. We write out this sentencing on ourselves. You can call it your conscience. You can call it your informed understanding of what's right and wrong. The truth is, we can be our biggest accusers. And a lot of times, the accusations that we make against ourselves are correct. They're credible. They have truth to them. But then there are other times where sometimes we're lawyers who overanalyze and overreact. But whenever we face those accusations those accusations that we make against ourselves, we respond, right? We respond in several different ways. Sometimes we respond by justifying and rationalizing the reason that we have committed these crimes and have these charges. We make excuses for them. Or sometimes when we're presented with the truth of them, we just break underneath the guilt. We have no excuse. We realize we do deserve punishment and justice. So oftentimes, and again, in both of those extremes, we either ignore justice, we try to execute it ourselves. We work some kind of self-atonement to make up for the really bad things that we've done. Let's move on. Another source of accusation against us is from others. Again, we're in that witness box, and sometimes it's other people on the other side of that stand, right? You ever faced this before? Sometimes it's loved ones, parents, children, family members, friends. Sometimes it's enemies, people we disagree with, telling us about ourselves or the ways that we've hurt them or broken God's law and impacted them in some way. Sometimes we face accusations and charges in our sufferings, in our weaknesses. You're not strong enough. You're not smart enough. If you did this better, if you would do that better. The charges come in highlighting our insufficiencies. And the thing about our self-accusations, right, the thing that differs from this is that they don't usually present us with the element of surprise. If we are accusing ourselves, we kind of know where it's coming from. We understand, we get it. But when others are accusing us, sometimes it can come out of nowhere. It can blindside us. And that's usually what stings, right? The perception. Whether their charges are right or wrong, credible or not. What's so heavy is the perception from others that makes it really hard to bear. That produces guilt or shame or fear. That causes you to either ignore those things altogether or causes you to break underneath the guilt. So we see accusations and charges from ourselves, from others, but in addition to these sources of accusation, they're the charges that we face from our greatest spiritual adversary, which is Satan. And sometimes, maybe most times, he works in and through the voices of ourselves and others to charge us, to try to saddle us with guilt. He leans on and adds to the weight of those charges. He draws lines, false lines between our failures and our weaknesses and our sufferings and sins, and then what we deserve for these things or the reason why we're experiencing those things. This is what the accuser of our souls does. In this courtroom, he holds up God's law as a way to show that God couldn't be for us. God couldn't be for us because of how imperfectly we've kept his law. So brothers and sisters, when you're thinking about these charges and where they come from, even from this past week, or recently in your life as you're going, maybe you're going through a season of suffering or weakness or sin, what charges are you facing? What charges are you facing? Where are they coming from? What charges are you facing? And maybe even more so, what are you charging you with this week? What have you been charging yourself with? What are others charging you with? What is Satan saying to your soul about your weaknesses and your sins and your sufferings? What false lines is he drawing to the reasons behind these things? In what ways are you carrying guilt in here today? Fear, shame, doubt. More than that, how are you fighting these charges? How have you been fighting these accusations? Denial? Deflection? Ignoring them? Maybe self-atonement? Trying to do more, trying to try harder to do better next time. And then I will eliminate the charges. I'll work them off. Community service. Maybe fighting them with more morality. Putting more laws in place, right? There's God's law, but I really need to tweak this and just break this down a little bit more to establish more laws in my life. And I can keep these little laws and I'll keep the big ones. Or maybe you're relativizing and rationalizing everything. Well, God knows my heart, right? He knows me. This is just who I am. It doesn't really matter, right? I didn't hurt anybody. I'm not that bad. Not as bad as this person. How are you fighting these charges? Brothers and sisters, all of these things, from denial to rationalizing and relativizing these things, they're all failed strategies because they don't actually deal with the charges that are true, the charges that we deserve. Again, the truth is that as Christians, as followers of Jesus, we still break God's law every single day. We are presented with charges, credible or not. And all of these things are presented before us in God's courtroom. The ways that we fail to love God, the ways that we fail to love our neighbors. And those credible charges, those truthful charges, they require justice. Somebody must pay. These things aren't going to go away, no matter how hard we try to ignore them or minimize them. These charges must be faced. So whether or not the charges and the accusations we faced are credible, whether they're from ourselves or others, the truth is, from Romans chapter 8, verse 33 and the entire chapter, the truth is that if we are God's children, His elect, His chosen, which means that if He's been for us in the way that Romans chapter 8, verse 29 describes, knowing us from before the foundation of the world, loving us, predestinating us, calling us, justifying us, and continuing to glorify us and make us more into the image of Jesus, if He's been for us in that way, and that we've entrusted our lives to Him and have hoped in Him, then it means that whatever charges that are presented against us, they won't stick. No matter how true they are, no matter the ways that we failed God's law, if this is who we are, the children of God, the reality that points to His choosing us, loving us, then these real accusations, these real charges won't stick. Look, brothers and sisters, again, this doesn't mean that they're not true. It doesn't mean that they're ignored or that they disappear in some legal loophole that never meets justice. This also doesn't mean that our law breaking doesn't have earthly consequences. It also doesn't mean that the voices of our accusers will go away and just be silenced once and for all. We're going to live with these charges. Something new coming into our courtroom every single day, every single week, every single moment of our lives, of the ways that we do not deserve God's grace and mercy because we have broken God's law and we failed. Now, what this means is that whatever we've been charged with in our lives, it has been dealt with. It has been dealt with directly. God doesn't just say, okay, and just go to wave His hand at it. He looks your charges, your guilt, your sin in the face, and He deals with it. He says it's not okay, but it has been taken care of. Justice has been met concerning it. And whatever we get charged with that's new charges that come into our lives every single day, they don't negatively impact our fundamental identity as God's adopted and accepted children. Who can bring a charge? Who can bring a credible accusation that will undo this work of God's grace and mercy in transforming you and adopting you as His child? Who can undo that with a charge? Nobody is the point of this passage. No one can bring a charge against God's elect. He's got you. It's not about what you have done or haven't done. It's about who He is and how he has intentionally and lovingly committed himself to you through his son Jesus. So how does this work? How does this not turn us into Teflon Dons who escape some real penalties that we deserve? Because it's God who justifies. It's God who justifies, which means that God is for us by declaring us not guilty in the face of all the ways that we have broken his law. The verdict is not guilty. All of the true and credible charges against us have been dealt with. As a matter of fact, they've been dropped. End of sentence, period. We have been forgiven. Again, not this sense of it says, it's okay, let's move on. No, it is not okay, and it has been dealt with. This is just one side of the coin of what the Bible calls justification, our being justified and declared righteous before God. It means that we're not guilty. But it also, again, means that we're declared righteous. We are forgiven and accepted by God. We are treated legally as if we've never violated God's law. That's really hard for us to wrap our minds around, right? Because we see ourselves. We're constantly looking at ourselves and we say, nope, I have breaking God's law. I will break God's law. I do break God's law. But the legal reality, one that's not based on your feelings, one that's not based on your experience per se, on how we perceive those things to be, but one that's based on the legal fact that God has plastered across the entire creation, that this person who's entrusted themselves to the person and work of God's Son Jesus, this person is not guilty. God is pleased with us as if we have lived perfectly. That's the truth. That's the reality. And this is accomplished for us because Jesus has sacrificially lived perfectly in our place and has dealt directly with our sin. And the charges that once stuck to us, they've been dropped, but they now stick to him. Your charges, your sin, the accusations that have come against you and that will come against you are on Jesus. They stick to him. It is God who justifies. So, brothers and sisters, if we're followers of Jesus and the children of God, then we can know that our standing with God isn't the result of a hollow forgiveness or some twisting of the system. The accusations that you make against yourself or the accusations that others make against you, they have been legally dealt with. Jesus has taken your charges on himself, bearing the justice in his body that you deserve. And what he's done, he has dropped the charges. A pastor named Richard White wrote a gospel song some years back that captures this reality beautifully in its lyrics. The title of the song is called Jesus Dropped the Charges, and the lyrics go like this. He says, I was guilty of all the charges, doomed and disgraced, but Jesus, with his special love, saved me by his grace. He pleaded and he pleaded and he pleaded my case. And I'm so glad that Jesus dropped the charges. Jesus dropped the charges. Now I am saved by grace through faith. Jesus has dropped your charges, brothers and sisters. They do not stick against you. What does that look like for you as you are staring, again, the very real accusations that you put on yourself, that others put on you, well, that Satan himself puts on you? What does it look like for you right now to look those things in the face, maybe as credible as they are, or even as untrue as they are, and to say, I am justified. I am not guilty because my sin has been placed on God's Son. What would look different in your life this week if you lived knowing that this was a legal reality and that nothing could undo that? Nothing could undo that. God's grace and his mercy and his goodness, his holiness and his righteousness have sealed that reality. Would you live with more joy? Real joy. Would you stop trying to do more and try harder to earn God's acceptance and his love? Would you go to him before you try to get it all together so that you can feel accepted? Would you have joy in doing what he commands us to do? And even when you fail, you just get back up and try again. Because you see that his love for you is the reason that you are his child. Not because of what you can do and what you haven't done. The fact that Jesus has dropped the charges is freedom for us, brothers and sisters. It is true freedom. So let's move on to the next question. Who is the one that brings an accusation or a charge? No one. Next question. Who is the one who condemns? Now, this is essentially asking the same kind of question, but condemns and condemnation, legal condemnation is a stronger term than charge. This is punishment. This is sentencing. When it comes to the voices of ourselves or others or even Satan himself, this is them or us telling us this is what you deserve because of these charges. Death, broken relationships, the ending of your life, failure, whatever it is, this is the sentence. And we see this all around, right? I mean, people talk about cancel culture enough, but we are constantly presenting each other with condemnation, with sentences. When you committed this crime, this is how you must pay. End of sentence, end of story. Again, condemnation is a stronger term. It's punishment, it's sentencing. This is a permanent notation of guilt on your record. One that will not be removed, one that will not be forgotten about or overlooked, along sometimes with earthly or eternal consequences. And the same thing that's true for our accusations is true for our condemnation. The judge has spoken. The judge has spoken in a very real way on behalf of those who love him, on behalf of those who he loves, and has chosen and adopted as his children. And what does he say to our very real sentence of condemnation that shows up in our courtrooms? As we're holding our breath, waiting to find out what it is we're actually going to face for our breaking God's law. Sentencing that comes from God himself. The judge has spoken. And he said that we are not guilty. And this points back all the way back to Romans chapter 8, verse 1. There is therefore, because of Jesus, who delivers us in our wretchedness, which is the word Paul used in Romans chapter 7. Because of his delivering us, there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Jesus. So again, we see from that verse that Jesus deals directly with our condemnation and our inability to keep God's law. The same thing's highlighted here. We don't have to face condemnation or punishment. The sentencing that we put on ourselves and the sentencing that others put on us or that Satan puts on us. The reality that we will have to face death because of our sin. It's not true anymore because of Jesus. Again, in this courtroom, as our sentencing is read to us, Jesus stands in our place, taking our condemnation on himself. And his work covers us for all time. Jesus looks at our past. This judge, he looks at our past, our present, and our future. And Jesus' comprehensive work covers our entire lives. In all the ways that we've broken God's law, in all the ways that we've failed, in all the ways that we've sinned, and the ways that we've been sinned against. Look at verse 34. It communicates this in the way that it uses these verbs, past and present and future. Why is this reality true? That who is the one who condemns? The answer is no one. It's because Jesus is the one who's died. You won't face death because it's Christ who died, even though you broke the law. Even though you've been presented with charges and guilt and real condemnation, Christ died. It's been solved, it's been met, it's been satisfied. Whatever is trying to condemn us is looking to put us to death, but Jesus has already died in our place. And even more than that, he's been raised, which means that he has fully served the sentence for our crimes. When we deserve death, and that is the final sentence, separation from God forever, eternally, Jesus has been raised from death. He's quenched the sentence and the satisfaction of justice. It's been met, and so he gets back up. God raises him up from the dead, and he's left your death and your punishment and your sentencing down in the ground. He has paid for it. And now he himself is the receipt through his resurrection that your penalty, your punishment has been met. It has been satisfied. It cannot haunt you or hold something over you for the rest of your life. Your condemnation has been met. It's been paid for. It's been legally satisfied. That's it. Like so many times we try to read this relational thing into the gospel, into the good news of what Jesus has done for us, and that's one element of it, and that's great and it's beautiful. God does this in his love, but there's this element and aspect of legality too. This is the law. This is his beautiful and glorious and perfect system of what he does for sinful people like us. And nothing in this world and in this universe can undo that. This is the way it should be. This is right in God's courtroom. This is justice. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says about the resurrection, if Jesus hasn't been raised, then we're still in our sin. If he hasn't been raised, if God does not raise Jesus from the dead, as Romans 8, a little bit further back, talks about, by the power of God's Spirit living within him, then you and I, our sin is still there. And we're just hoping or wishing or crossing our fingers or doing whatever. The fact that Jesus has been raised, he has actually been raised from actual death, means that your sin, my sin, has been forgiven. We do not have to face death as a punishment and a sentence, but we face it as a doorway into greater, exponentially greater life. Our mortality will put on immortality. We will live with God forever in a new heavens and a new earth, just like this one, with new bodies. And that's been secured through Christ's work. So the resurrection doesn't just give us the hope of a new body, but the very resurrected life of Jesus is the evidence that we have truly been forgiven by God. And God is not condemning us for breaking his law in our past, our present, or even in our future. As long as Jesus lives, as long as he is, as long as he lives, as long as he continues to be resurrected from death, then this legal reality of our justification for all who trust in him stands. It stands. And the clearest evidence of that, because we can't see the physical Jesus walking around here in his new body, again, we still have evidence. We still have hope and assurance. Because the fact it goes on that says that he is currently, right now, presently, at this very moment, at the right hand of God. In the highest position in the universe, in the entire created order, at the right hand of God, doing what? Interceding for us. Your charges won't stand against you. Your condemnation won't be brought against you and won't be carried out against you, because Jesus is. He is seated at the right hand of God, and he is interceding, praying for you, mediating for you, presenting your case, pleading your case, as those lyrics said, seeing to it that the charges that are brought against you are dropped. This is the reality. A few weeks back, we talked about God's Spirit praying for us in our groanings and in our weaknesses. Even when we don't have the words to say, even when we don't feel like praying, God's Spirit prays for us. And now this verse goes on to tell us, verse 34, that Jesus himself does the very same thing. God himself has forgiven us. He's satisfied justice. And Jesus isn't trying to convince him to keep doing that for us. No, this is harmony. This is him being our representative. That this reality is true for all who trust in him, for all who turn from their sin and stop trying to fix it ourselves, deny it or minimize it, but who look it in the face and say, there's nothing that I can do to be good with God. I must trust in God's Son, who does for me what I can't do for myself. In a legal sense, Jesus is our mediator. And because of that, we can confess our sin. As 1 John says, we can confess our sin, and what's God's response? He is faithful. No matter what you bring or how often you come to him, he is faithful and he is just. It is the right thing for him to do to see that your charges, your condemnation is dropped, and remind you that your charges and condemnation are dropped. Because you are his child. Jesus is there to point to himself as the one who has fully and finally dealt with our guilt and our sin. So brothers and sisters, listen, for all the ways that you have brought condemnation against yourself, or the ways that you've felt and faced that in your life right now, all the charges that you bring against yourself. Again, we can know in full assurance that we can turn from our sin. In those moments when those accusations and that condemnation is real, we can repent. We can trust in the finished work of Jesus. And we can know that those very real charges won't stick. They do not have the final say over our lives. Again, certainly we face consequences for our sin. We face broken earthly realities. But none of those things impact the full and final effect that God says, I love you, I am for you, and I am with you, not because of anything you've done or haven't done, but because of what Jesus has done for you, in your place for your sins. And now he himself, seated at the right hand of God, is the receipt for you and I to know that God has accepted us, forgiven us, and that he is eternally committed to working all things, even your worst failures and fears and sins and guilt, for your good. That's the promise. And that's how we can have high ground, even when we stand in the courtroom, face these charges and this guilt and condemnation. We can know confidently and say confidently, who? Again, not because of us, but in looking at God's Son. Let me pray for us.